Do you ever wonder how to use Photoshop to replace the background to your photos to get professional results like this? Well, if you do, then keep watching because you're going to find out. Photoshop Unleashed will teach you everything you need to master the platform and really take your images to a new level. Now, there is a code available which will give you a massive early bird discount which you can use when the course becomes available. If you don't have that code, there's a link up here or a link down there. Go and grab that code now and keep it somewhere safe. Welcome, I'm Nick Church, founder of the Nick Church Creative Academy. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to use Photoshop to replace the background of our headshots or our portraits with a method that is really simple but so powerful. It lets you change the color, the tone, texture of the background, and even automatically add authentic shadows which create a very professional, polished finish. So why do you want to replace the background anyway? Well, there's loads of reasons. If you shot with a backdrop initially, it might be that when you came to edit, you could see there was wrinkles, creases, marks on the background. You may have harsh shadows from your lights. The lights themselves might even be in the shot, or the edge of the backdrop might be in the shot as well. Personally, I love this method because it means I don't need to worry about a backdrop at all. I can just shoot in an open office or someone's home, even with busy backgrounds like this, and create a really professional studio finish. All right, I'm going to share my screen now and go through the process clearly, step by step, so you can follow along. So here we are in Adobe Lightroom. This is the image we're going to work on today. So this was retouched in Lightroom. You can see the before and afters there. So I did all of that in Adobe Lightroom Classic. If you're interested in a workshop on Lightroom, then I have my Lightroom Unleashed online course, which will be available at the launch of the Nick Church Creative Academy. So we can see there's a really nice portrait, but with an awful background of sensor spots. It's a pretty dull grey colour. And we can see that there's vignetting where the lights haven't quite got as far into the corners. Now, the lighting I used for this was a really simple setup. We had just a single light here as a key light, and then by the camera, another light just lifting the shadows a little bit. These weren't really expensive studio lights. It was just my speed lights on stands. So it just shows that you can create really nice portraits with kit you've probably already got. All right, so we need to take this now into Photoshop because we want to replace this background. Now, what we'll notice before we do that is I've used quite a deep depth of field for this portrait. So they're a little bit softer at the back, but it's sharp front to back. Now, that's quite important when we come to replacing a background, as we'll see later. Now, the easiest way to get things into Photoshop is to do right-click, edit in Adobe Photoshop. So this has the advantage of it loads it into Photoshop, but also it means when we work on it and then subsequently save it, it will appear back in here alongside this current image as a new photo, which we could then go and edit again if we wanted to. So it just keeps everything within Lightroom. And if you're doing lots of portraits at the same time, like headshots for a company, say, and then want to export them all in one go, that's a great workflow because it keeps it all within Lightroom. Okay, so here we are now in Photoshop. We can see that the layer has been opened as a background layer, which is fine. I'm just going to unlock that just because we're going to make changes to that shortly. Now, in this lesson, we are going to use layers, we're going to use masks, we're going to use blend modes, and also the brush tool. Now, all of those things have already been included in previous lessons, so I'm not going to go through them again. However, if you've just jumped straight into this lesson, or this is the only one that you've looked at so far, then it's fine because you can still follow along and get the same effect that I've got with this portrait. So the first thing we're going to need to do is we need to separate our subject from this awful looking background. Now, the way to do that is we use any of these selection modes here, doesn't matter which one we use, they all give this select subject or select and mask option. So we're going to go into the select and mask panel by clicking that. Now, as we can see initially, nothing selected. So if I take transparency right up, you can see there's nothing there. Let's put it on a black background. So we need to select our subject. Now, we could try and do this manually, but it's much better to let Photoshop do it because they put millions of pounds into deciding exactly where the edge of a subject is, and it's much quicker. So we're going to select subject, click that, and we'll see immediately it's gone through and it's selected the whole subject, including all the little stray hairs here and there, which is just a fantastic job. I like to leave these stray hairs in, by the way. I don't remove them. I think it looks really natural and just makes the subject just look a bit more alive than sort of removing everything and making it perfect. Now, you remember earlier we said about using a fairly deep depth of field. This is the bit that's much more successful if you've got very crisp photo front to back. Photoshop can much more easily follow the line of the hair, get those individual strands of hair. It can look a little bit odd if you have a very narrow depth of field photo for this technique. One thing I am going to do, you can see around this edge, we've got a little bit of the background coming through. If we click decontaminate colors over here, then that will get rid of that and makes it an even more accurate cutout. So we're going to have the output mode go into a new layer with layer mask. And if we click OK on that one, then there we go. So we can see that we've got the original layer under here. It's automatically hidden that layer. So we've got that just as a backup if we need to go back to anything. And we can see we've got our subject automatically masked out, or the background masked out. So if I hide that mask, we can go back to the original, although it's not the original. You can see that this is part of the decontaminate layers, decontaminate background operation that we did. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put a solid color adjustment layer in there. Now, that's because it's useful to have that, because when we add a texture, if we've got a solid color in here, we can then change the color of the background at any point, which is a really useful thing, as we'll see later. So I'm just going to select any color, doesn't matter at this stage. Now, as we see, I've created it as the top layer. So I need to bring that down underneath this one so that she is on top of the background. Okay, so that already looks pretty good. Now we can see what I mean about the color here. If we double click that, I can change this background color to be anything that I want to, which is just a really flexible way of working. Now, what I always like to have in my portraits is some sort of texture. So I'm going to drag over a JPEG of a texture I've got. There's loads of these that are free resources on the internet. I will link to this particular texture below the video, so you could download this exact same one, but it honestly doesn't really matter. You can take your own, just take photos of a brick wall or plastered wall, and that's all we need to do. So we now have our subject masked out. We've got our texture, but as we'll see, we're still in normal blend mode here. So that's why we can't see any of the background layer below. So what we're going to do is just change with the texture selected. We're going to change that to be something. Soft light normally works pretty well. Now, what that will do is it will take the texture and all the contrast of that layer, but it will also show the tone of this base layer behind that we did initially. So as we can see, if I now go and change that color again, I can change the color of that background while still preserving the texture and all of the detail that's on that background. Okay. So that already is looking loads better. So one thing that I can notice straight away is that the background is very sharp. Now, if we were in a real studio, the background would be slightly out of focus because it would be behind the focal plane. So all I'm going to do to fix that is select our layer for the background and then go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian blur, and that's going to bring up this panel, which is a Gaussian blur is the most natural type of blur. It's what our eyes do and what lenses do. So if I reduce that now, we can see the background going out of focus. Let's make it a little bit stronger, but so you've still got some of the tones and the texture in there. There we go. That looks about right to me. So that's now looking really good. Just one bit of housekeeping I'm going to do. We've got the texture, we've got the filter from the blur, and we've also got that background color. I'm just going to use Shift to select all of these, right click and create a group from those layers. I'm going to call it background, just to keep things a little bit tidier, and that'll form that group. This one doesn't matter because that's not shown anyway, it's just our original layer. So the thing that's missing now is that we haven't got any shadow. Now, if she was in a real studio, she would be casting some sort of shadow on the background. And that's the thing that anchors our subject to our background. The thing with shadows is they aren't black. They're not just a dark color painted on. They're actually exactly the same as the background, just with darker levels of light. So rather than trying to paint on the actual layer, all we're going to do is reduce the brightness of this background. We do the whole group in one go. And I'm going to do that with a curve adjustment layer. Again, adjustment layers and effects are covered in previous lessons of the Photoshop Unleashed course. So I'm just going to pull down the brightness and make this layer much darker, and that's going to be our shadow. Now we don't want the whole thing to be shadow, but I'm just getting the shadow color correct, so that's fine. I don't want it any darker than that. So how do we get the right shape? So if I invert this, this is now, because this is white, this is all having the effect. Let me invert it with Command I, and we're back to as we were. This is a black layer, so none of that's having an effect. What we want is a shadow. So what better outline to use than the outline that Photoshop's already decided is the subject? So we're just going to drag this mask onto here. It can be a bit fiddly. You have to make sure you press Alt on Windows or Option on Mac before you start clicking and moving. Otherwise, it will just move it rather than copy it. So I'm going to click my Option key, then drag and drop it into there. And it's going to say replace that existing one, which I do want to do. So we've now got the same layer mask on both. So you might wonder, why can't we see anything? And that's because this shadow, which this is creating, is completely underneath the subject. It's the same layer mask. So all we're going to do is just change the size of that layer mask. So we want to click this layer. We might make sure it's still linked like that. Click the layer, and we're going to do a free transform, which just lets you change the size, position, and shape of a layer. So the easiest way to do that is Command T or Control T on Windows. And if we then increase the size of it, we can move and position that layer, position that shadow somewhere that makes sense. So it would probably, if the main light's come up here, it's probably going to be down a bit, and it'll be slightly bigger. Okay. And incidentally, this is how you decide how far away you want her to look from the background, which is how big and where the shadow is positioned. So that's about right for me, I think. So hit Enter to lock that transform in place. What we'll see is, because we moved the whole mask over, it's left this white area, which is now coming through as shadow. So we're just going to brush that back in. Now, to brush that back in, we just need to paint black into this mask, not into the image, into the mask. So click that, select brush. We've got black selected already, so we can now just go in and brush this back into black on the mask, making sure I don't go over her head, because that would change the effect. We just want to replace that, get that back to as it was. Perfect. Now, one thing you'll notice is this shadow is very hard, and that's because we have got no feather. So if we look at that, we can see there's no feather on this mask. So with this mask selected, we're just going to go up and adjust the feather control until we get the softness that we want on that mask. As you can see, it's getting softer and softer. And again, this is another thing that makes the subject look very close to the background or much further away. So we can just bring it back to wherever we want it. Let's say about there. Okay. So that's our mask in place. Now, if you feel that the mask is a bit, if the shadow is a bit too strong, then all we need to do now is just go to the opacity layer with our shadow mask selected, change the opacity to something other than 100, and we'll see that's going to fade away to nothing. So we just move that up until we've got the level of shadow that gives the effect we're looking for. That seems about fine to me. There we go. That's locked it in. It makes her look like she's present in this scene against a real background, and that's pretty much finished. Okay, so one more thing to do. We're now going to head back into Lightroom. Before we do that, we can decide what we do with these layers. Now, if we leave the layers separate, then when we go into Lightroom, it will preserve all those layers and mean we can bring it back and re-edit it. If we don't want to do that, if we know this is a single portrait and we're absolutely happy with it as it is, then we can select all of these, right-click, flatten the image, which will just compress everything into a single layer. So the advantage of doing that is that it's a much smaller resulting file. Disadvantage being you can't go back and adjust the layers. So if you were doing multiple headshots of different people, or if you think you might want to come back in and change the color of the background, then you want to leave these layers as they are. So let's go and just make that a bit more of a muted color. I think it's a bit strong before. There we go. All right, so now all I have to do is close this image, and it asks me if I want to save. Then hitting save automatically will save that photo and re-import it back into Lightroom, because that's how we launched this image in the first place. And that's the great thing about this workflow, is it just keeps everything centered in Lightroom. What's going to happen is when that's finished saving, it's going to pop up alongside our original image. And there we go. So it's popped in alongside the original in the same catalog, and that's now ready to be exported. So the beauty of this, again, is if we had multiple people, I could then just bring their images into that same Photoshop file and create exactly the same backdrop for all of them, and then export them all in one go from Lightroom. The other good thing we can do, because this is now a PSD, you can see here we've got PSD for this one, and this one is still the RAW. So from the PSD, we can then edit in Photoshop again. Now this time, because it's already been edited, it's asking us whether we want to edit the original, which would update this image, whether we want to edit a copy and create a new version, or if we want to edit the copy with Lightroom adjustments. This top one is probably not ideal. What it does is it flattens the image on the way to Photoshop, so you lose all your layers. I'm going to do a copy. Let's pretend that this is my favorite color, but this client, let's say she wants more of a blue colored background. I'm going to edit a copy rather than overwrite the one that I like. Open that in Photoshop. That image now loads with all of the stuff that we had in there before. So I can go straight to our color tone. She said she wants more of a blue color, so I can just dial straight in to a blue, whether it's very strong or a bit more subtle. So something like that, I think that's nice as well. So we're gonna okay that, she'll be happy with that. I can close this image, save it, and because we opened as copy, it's gonna add another photo to our catalog with this blue version of the background. So back in Lightroom now, this is just saving in the background, and we should see at any moment that will now pop up back in here. There it is. So we've got the blue version that she likes, we've got that version that I like, and they're all saved as separate files. We can go back in and edit those as much as we like. All right, guys, so that was a short, small, free lesson of the full Photoshop Unleashed course. That full course will teach everything you need to know in Photoshop, up to that point of using masks, adjustment layers, and blend modes, and loads further to do really, really complex projects as well. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to catching up with you next time.